Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 7th, 2022. Yesterday, on October 6th, we had quite an extraordinary event sponsored by the Executive Intelligence Review. It was a webcast titled, "We Will Not Be Silenced: Speaking Truth in Times of War." And this was an extremely interesting event, and I hope you had a chance to watch it live. If not, it is archived, and there's a link at the bottom of the description page so you can go take a look at it. It included a number of courageous journalists, former diplomats, retired intelligence officials, and activists speaking on the whole question of the threat of nuclear war coming from the NATO policy toward Ukraine, as well as the efforts by NATO, the United States, working with the Ukrainian government to silence opposition using institutions called the Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotvorets. Now, the basic point of all the speakers was an appeal to reason, that the war must be ended, that there needs to be a new security and financial architecture which represents the sovereign interests of all nations, and that this is urgent because the continuation of this war is doing nothing except propelling the world toward the brink of a thermonuclear catastrophe. Now, among the presentations were Colonel Richard Black, who spoke on did the US and NATO blow up the Nord Stream pipelines. This has already had over 300,000 views as a separate video, and Black, as he always does, laid out the military, strategic, and legal consequences of not addressing this action. And his conclusion is that it was most likely the United States and NATO, but watch for yourself. You can reach your own conclusions. Helga Zepp-LaRouche spoke. She addressed why the Schiller Institute is a special target of these so-called disinformation hit lists. And she did it from reflecting back on an event from October 6th, 1986, when she and her husband, Lyndon, were subjected to an attack by 400 armed agents of various governments, including the FBI, in the Get LaRouche task force, and that they only escaped assassination by action taken from the Reagan administration. Other speakers included Eva Bartlett, who gave an eyewitness report from the Donbass. Interesting, if you have the misfortune of listening to BBC, they've had nonstop coverage of the shelling the day before yesterday of an apartment complex in Zaporizhia city, where they go in excruciating detail about the deaths, which now I think are 10 or 11 people. But not once have they mentioned the Ukrainian shelling of cities in the Donbass, which have had many more victims than that and are taking place day after day. And this is what Eva Bartlett reported on. Why not mention those? Well, that's part of the censorship. Other speakers included U.S. Senate candidate Diane Sayre, former CIA operatives Graham Fuller and Ray McGovern. Again, there's a link at the bottom of the page for you to watch this, and I would encourage you to watch it and share it. Now, since it's Friday, I'm going to take 3 questions that I think, out of the many that were sent, sort of get at what's on people's minds. Several people asked about stories that are appearing in the press. The fact that the New York Times 2 days ago had a story on the U.S. government's response to the assassination by car bomb of Daria Dugina, which the Russians have said was done by Ukraine. And also on the Daily Mirror ran an article on revenge killings in Ukraine, citing Ukrainian officials saying they are shooting like pigs collaborators. So why is that coming out now? What does this portend? Now, the New York Times article cites U.S. intelligence officials, naturally unnamed, but they say that they have concluded that Ukraine is behind the killing of Dugina. Daria Dugina, the daughter of Russian philosopher Dugin, that the U.S. took no part in these killings, that American officials admonished Ukrainian officials for the assassination. And the article said they expressed concern that future such attacks, quote, could widen the conflict, unquote. Now, the Russian spokesman for President Putin, Peskov, said with qualifications that this is a positive sign, but he did express concern that it could be an effort by the United States, quote, to absolve themselves of responsibility for some plots for future terror attacks that Ukraine may be involved in, unquote. Now, this is, of course, quite a significant statement because the U.S. putting out this statement is quite unusual given that the U.S. has so far tried to keep a certain distance from the dirtier aspects of the war going on in Ukraine. But the people who wrote this story in the New York Times know the story which was the subject of the EIR conference and which we've publicized, namely of U.S.-NATO involvement in drafting hit lists or kill lists produced by the committee, the Ukrainian Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotvorets, and that Dugina was on that hit list. So why was that not mentioned? If in fact you're coming clean and saying we're not involved in this, why are there U.S. officials at the meetings of this committee, and why have they funded it? So meanwhile, you have a Zelensky spokesman, Podolyak, who admitted, quote, we have other targets on the territory of Ukraine. So our demand is that all U.S. NATO support be ended for these institutions that are producing these lists, and that the role of Western governments, instead of funding these kinds of provocations, instead of supporting the intimidation and possible killing of people who disagree with the U.S. and Western policy, that the U.S. government should be engaged in demanding an end to the fighting instead of stoking the flames of war. And it raises an additional question. Why is there no outcry from the West against the targeting of people who are posing questions such as, shouldn't we have a security architecture for Russia and Ukraine? This is the demand of the Schiller Institute. This is why 31 people who have participated at Schiller Institute conferences have been put on these hit lists. So it shows that minimally the New York Times story is only part of the story, but that one suspicion that it's part of a cover-up, as Peskov may have been implying, certainly is real. I would argue, or I would not argue, I would encourage you to join our mobilization to get the U.S. Congress to stop funding these operations. The Congress should stop funding the war in general, stop shipping arms to the Ukrainian military, but in particular, congressional funding that's going to civil institutions in Ukraine that are trying to silence American voices in the United States. That's not only un-American, it's unconstitutional and should be stopped. Now, a second question, why did Liz Truss reverse the tax cut? Now, this was a very important event because her whole economic policy was based on a huge tax cut modeled on the Margaret Thatcher policy from the mid-1980s. At the same time, pumping money to bail out bankrupt firms, both supposedly to fight inflation. Now, this is just a complete confused jumble of idiocy. She and Kwartung, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, actually believe that a big tax cut will stimulate the economy when the fact is that inflation is robbing people of their ability to keep their homes warm and feed their children. With food and fuel going through the roof and wages stuck, the situation in the United Kingdom is ripe for an explosion. And there's a significant backlash with a strike wave developing, rail workers, dock workers, nurses, and so on. Meanwhile, the UK credit rating was downgraded to negative yesterday. But Truss and Kwarteng remain committed to the Thatcherite dogma, the neoliberal policy, which they reasserted that, well, this is a step back, but we will continue in this direction in the future. Now, the solution is what the Schiller Institute has proposed, what Lyndon LaRouche proposed with his 4 laws. You have to stop bailing out bankrupt institutions and instead put them through bankruptcy reorganization. Stop pumping funny money into the economy to bail out swindlers, and instead establish a credit agency, a national bank, which funds real physical economic activity. If you don't do that, then you're not serious about fighting inflation or improving the standards of living of your population. But you can't do that in one country. We need a new Bretton Woods. We need an international agreement to reestablish fixed exchange rates and to make sure that the currencies that are being used, whether we stick with the dollar or whether we move to the proposal to use national currencies, that they be reflective of something of real value. That is, an economy which is producing, as opposed to an economy which main product is printing money. So further, in terms of the situation in England, no special status for the City of London. It's about time that the City of London give up its imperial dreams and be forced to live under regulated system in which none of them have any real experience because they're so used to running governments and running central banks. Now, the last question is, what do you make of the announcement by OPEC that they're going to reduce the production of oil? This was played up in the media as a rejection of an appeal from Biden, a slap in the face to the United States. So why was this done? Well, as we've been reporting, much of the world is rejecting the sanctions policy of the Western governments, as well as the Green New Deal policy, which simply says fossil fuels are polluting, are causing man-made climate change, and have to be shut down. That's a hard sell for the West to convince the Saudis to do that. But the reduction of production is partly oriented toward making sure the prices are sustained, because if you dramatically increase production and distribution of oil, the Saudis fear that this might reduce their profit. But more importantly, there's a shift away from the unipolar superpower order, where the United States and London can order nations what to do. Now, we're seeing something fairly interesting occurring. The Biden administration is now appealing to Venezuela, which the U.S. has been engaged in a bipartisan commitment to overthrow the government there. And the sanctions from the United States are estimated to have killed between 40 and 50,000 people. Now the United States is going to Venezuela because they need oil. And especially they're trying to get a deal for Chevron. So you can see the desperation. We saw it in Germany when Chancellor Scholz went to the Middle East to make all kinds of promises and to beg for natural gas and liquefied natural gas and oil, and came back basically empty-handed. Again, the solution is not to look for special deals for your country, but to recognize that the global financial system is broken. The Great Reset is rejected by most countries because it's based on taking away their sovereignty. And as long as you have countries such as Russia and China, which can stand up against these demands, then you'll see support coming from countries like Indonesia, from Brazil, from the oil-producing countries, which are looking for a consistent commitment to real physical economic production and being paid for their products with real money as opposed to funny money. And so I think the important thing here is not so much the question of are the Saudis rejecting Biden. Most of the world is rejecting the demands for sanctions against Russia. And countries are looking at how they can move away from submitting to the unreasonable and unacceptable demands coming from the sole superpower backed by the military force of the United States and NATO. This is where the LaRouche solution is unique and will work. And I'd urge you, study the video from the Executive Intelligence Review conference yesterday, and then use that as an entry point to go into our websites and look at what we're writing, what we're producing on economy, on the strategic relations. And we have a series of events coming up, including on October 15th, an International Youth Conference. Sign up for that today and have a thoughtful weekend. And I'll see you again on Monday.